Welcome back. I am very honored to welcome our next discussion. The importance of America's manufacturing sector has been top priority for the past two administrations, and trade policy has been a crucial tool in their efforts to bolster American manufacturing might and help it thrive in a competitive global marketplace. The National Association of Manufacturers is the point of that spear, and we couldn't be more pleased than to host their president and CEO, Jay Timmons, to talk about how trade can support America's vital manufacturing sector. Jay is joined on stage by the man behind the pen, who's been telling us the story about trade policy for over 20 years, Doug Palmer of POLITICO. Doug? Great.
Thanks very much. As Ken said, I'm Doug Palmer with POLITICO, and I'm pleased to be here with Jay Timmons, who's president and CEO.
I'll answer anything. It's okay.
Of the National Association of Manufacturers, and you've been president there since I think president and CEO since 2011.
Yeah, if I was under deposition, I'm not sure I'd remember what the date was, but I think it was 2011. That sounds about right.
Well, I was impressed because I looked at your bio and I saw that you came to Washington in like the 1980s, and you worked as a press secretary for, I think, a pair of different congressmen.
So I actually dropped out of college because I wanted to be part of, ironically, where we're sitting, the Reagan Revolution, and never got a chance to actually work in the Reagan White House, but it was always my dream. And he was really kind of my inspiration and what really motivated me. His if you will, his worldview really impressed me. And
right.
I couldn't do it there, but I was able to work for some members on Capitol Hill who were working to enact his agenda.
Right. And then I saw that you worked for Governor Allen, both when he was on the Hill and then when he was in the government.
Yeah, so later, so the congressmen were from North Carolina. Later, I worked for George Allen when he was a congressman, governor, senator.
Yeah.
And he was probably the younger version of Reagan in my mind anyway. So.
Right. Okay, cool. Well, I guess I would just ask you to start off by, could you give us a brief overview of what are NAM's trade priorities for the year? And then I thought that maybe we could dig into some issues. I've been thinking a lot about the WTO ministerial in a couple of weeks, and I know you guys are interested in seeing some trade legislation moved, and also are sort of frustrated that trade agreements aren't being negotiated. So I thought we could talk about that. But maybe if you could
That's a wrap.
If you could start off with a brief overview of what you'd like to see done in 2024.
Yeah, so the NAM was founded in 1895, Doug, and you and I have talked about this. We were really founded under the belief that we need to expand our access to markets around the world. Later, we got more involved in domestic policy. But our goal was to recognize the important place that American manufacturers had on the world economy. And so that was really the impetus for the birth of the NAM. And that's really been part of our DNA for all that time. What is that now, 129 years of the existence of our organization. But I think we look at trade, and I know our members do. So I have a very small and discreet board of directors of 250 members.
Right.
And the good news is that all of them, regardless of their size, whether they're multinational companies or the smallest mom and pop manufacturer, understand the importance of a liberalized system of trade around the world, because they know that that's good for their success, it's good for their communities' success. I was just speaking to Ambassador Moctezuma, who I think will be speaking here in just a little bit. And, he was making the point, and he makes it much more eloquently than I could, but that trade is really the recipe for peace and the recipe for working together harmoniously. So I think we look at trade through that lens, and we look at trade as a facilitator to obviously economic growth, but also the export, if you will, of our values and the American style of democracy. So some of our objectives, well, first and foremost, we'd like to see more trade agreements. We haven't seen one negotiated here in the United States for over 10 years, and the rest of the world, quite frankly, is they're eating our lunch when it comes to negotiating these agreements. Very simple issues like what you would think they would be simple issues, like the miscellaneous tariff bill, getting that done, gets locked up with all of the partisan back and forth. And an issue like that, I just don't quite understand it. I would probably add on to all of that issues that directly impact our ability to grow manufacturing in the United States so that we can trade. So I think of a stable tax policy. The tax reforms that we achieved in 2017 were incredibly important to manufacturers' ability to invest and hire and grow wages here in the United States. Regulatory certainty is critical for manufacturers to be able to compete here in the United States. Immigration reform is going to be important because we can invest all we want in manufacturing in the United States so that we can be a world leader, but if we don't have the people to do the jobs that we have open, right now 620,000, I think, in the manufacturing sector, we're not going to be able to aspire or to meet the aspirations that we have for being that global leader on trade or to continue to be that global leader. So all of those are kind of part of the NAM legislative and regulatory basket.
Well, thanks for that overview. I'd like to dig into the ministerial conference a little bit, the WTO ministerial. I mean, there's not a lot on that agenda to get manufacturers excited, I don't believe, but I know that you're worried about at least one thing, which is this COVID-19, this push for the expanded TRIPS waiver to cover therapeutics and diagnostics. Yeah. Why would that be a bad development from your point of view? Well,
look, I mean, intellectual property is truly the lifeblood of manufacturing. You know, we work pretty hard, and it's always been kind of a given from the U.S. perspective that intellectual property protections would be front and center. We saw the original TRIPS waiver with regard to the vaccine and the properties of the vaccine occur, and we were concerned about that. Obviously, we want to facilitate the growth of manufacturing in other areas of the world too, and we know that there are other ways to achieve what I think WTO was trying to achieve. But this is really that was a step too far. This is a giant leap too far if therapeutics and diagnostics are included in the waiver, an expanded waiver. I just don't know how you message to manufacturers if your government says okay to that, first and foremost, or if WTO does. But even if we're not exactly sure where we're going to see our government come down on that,
right?
If they give the green light, how then do they turn around and say, by the way, we want you to invest in developing more innovations here in this country if we're just going to turn around and give them away? It's a similar issue, which is not directly related to trade, but march-in rights is another issue that this administration is talking about implementing, which is the ability of the government to march in and take intellectual property or a patent away from a company if the government has been involved in helping to develop that particular product or patent. And so I think we're getting a rather mixed message. I would tell you today, and I say this all the time, I think this president is probably has a bigger heart for manufacturing than any I've worked with. And Ken mentioned that trade has been a priority for President Trump and President Biden, or I should say that the agenda has been front and center. I would say that the manufacturing agenda was front and center. I would say that manufacturing has been present for all of the presidents I've seen in action since Reagan, but in different ways. And I think we've reached a point where we have this amazing opportunity to see manufacturing truly just explode in terms of growth here in this country because of the focus on trade by Reagan, Bush 41, Clinton, Bush 43, Obama, because of the focus on competitive tax policy by the last administration, as well as regulatory certainty, because of the investments in chips and science and infrastructure, and even some of the policy provisions that President Biden pushed. All of that has led us to this I think, this pivotal point in the ability of manufacturing to really succeed in this country. But if we start chipping away at that progress by saying, at the very least, you can't protect a patent or you can't protect your intellectual property.
Right.
I don't think that's the right signal to be sending for further manufacturing investment.
Right. On the other hand, my understanding is that no country has actually used that vaccine waiver. So, and people who are on the other side of the issue argue, what the WTO approved in June 22 wasn't really all that significant. So, since no country actually used it, I mean, is it an exaggeration to get concerned about the therapeutics and diagnostics piece of it? I mean, maybe that would be equally as ineffective.
Well, whether it's effective or not, I think you're sending a message that you really do not respect the intellectual property rights of manufacturers.
Right.
So if you apply that theory to other products, whether they're biologics or pharmaceuticals or it could be anything, right?
Right. I mean, people talk about maybe this would set a precedence for green technologies or something.
Well, sure. There's green technology. I mean, there's tractors. I mean, you could apply this same theory to any product. So I think it's in manufacturers' best interest to protect that pretty basic value.
Right. Well, there's another issue at MC13 that I believe is important to NAM, and that's this 26-year-old moratorium on collecting collecting duties on e-commerce transmissions. Right. I mean, that seems to be mainly like digital goods, like DVDs or the digital versions of like movies on DVDs or music on CDs. But also people say, though, that electronic transmissions is a really vague term. It could literally cover any sort of business transaction that crosses borders electronically.
Well, that's our worry, right?
Right. So, I mean, I guess, how concerned are you?
Why is it a problem?
Yeah, why is it?
So I think, look, I think it comes down to your basic philosophy of whether you want to facilitate more trade, which I think most economists would say that is good for economic activity, right? Mm-hmm. You're going to continue to grow economies around the world, or whether you want to impede trade. Tariffs, also known as taxes, impede economic activity.
Right.
That's pretty basic. And sometimes governments want to do that for various reasons. I'm not sure why we would want to impede the ability of companies to grow and to innovate unless you're trying to send a signal that we should only be innovating here. Mm-hmm. And we should only be creating here. And I don't think in a global economy, and whether politically that resonates or not, a global economy,
right.
It's a fact. And I want to see our products treated fairly, and I want to make sure that our products have the opportunity to be exported and purchased by whether that is digital or electronic or a traditional manufactured good. Mm-hmm. I want the opportunity to sell those products to the 95% of the customers who live outside of the United States.
Right. Well, I'm a reporter. I'm going to be covering the WTO ministerial, and I'm hoping there's like a little bit of drama in that meeting. And I was wondering...
We'll create it for you.
Well, like, what if, for example, Catherine Tai is forced to choose between trying to get a continuation of the e-commerce moratorium or giving in on the TRIPS, an expansion of the TRIPS waiver? I mean, what if she's sort of presented with that as a choice in order to get consensus to do one thing or another? Is there one issue that she should go with? I mean, which of those is more important to you?
I'm going to state it another way. There is no instance where the United States should ever be forced into a position of compromise, period.
Okay.
And we just have to simply lead. And we have to lead not only there, but we have to lead in Geneva, right, at the WTO for issues like dispute settlement, the resolution on that.
Right.
We have to step up to the plate. Now, we're not sending necessarily the best message to the rest of the world when we go into these conferences if we're not willing to consider more free trade agreements around the world, if we're not leading in terms of expanding trade around the world, and we haven't been doing that. We haven't been doing that for a long time, over a decade, right? So I kind of reject the premise of your question there because I simply don't expect the United States is going to be forced to make to compromise.
Well, we'll see.
Or should it be?
We'll see what happens. Maybe I planted an idea. Okay. Well, on the subject of like U.S. leadership, I mean that's kind of been on my mind too, heading into this ministerial. It sounds like you're saying, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, that it's not leading on trade to the extent that it has in the past. I listened to a speech that Ambassador Tai gave in October or September at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and she talked about how the U.S. is a champion of the rules-based international trade system. And I just wondered, can the U.S. still really claim to be a champion of the rules-based international trade system? I mean, given that it's taken apart the dispute settlement system, or at least it's effectively killed the appellate body. It imposed those tariffs in the name of national security, which you can agree or disagree with.
The 232s?
The 232s. But the WTO did rule against it, and we said that we're not going to abide by that ruling. The China 301 tariffs, they were also ruled against by the WTO. I think the administration argues that, well, they worked out that bilaterally with China. But and then we've passed things like the Inflation Reduction Act, which contains all of these discriminatory provisions that seem to violate, most favored nation, treatment under the WTO rules. So I don't know. Are we still a champion of the rules-based international trade system?
Well, I think we should be. Okay. And I think that, look, I'm an unabashed free market proponent, and I think those rules should be based on market economies and not command economies. And I think that is truly the conflict that we have, whether we want to acknowledge it or not. I mean, we look at a country like China, which is treated as a developing economy at the WTO, which absolutely makes no sense whatsoever.
Right.
And we have a choice to make. And sometimes, do we do it right all the time? No, of course not. Do we aspire to do it right all the time? I would hope so. I hope that is our goal. I hope it's the goal of any elected leader and any administration. I give a lot of credit to this president for his foreign policy, his outreach with regard to foreign policy. That can translate into good relationships on the trade front as well. But look, I go back to, and I'm not sure how many folks agree with this, but I truly believe that free market economies and democracies generally need to stand up for that rules-based system. Because if we don't, it's a very different way of life if the command structure takes over.
Right.
And I'm concerned about where that leads, because it's not going to stop in terms of economic policy. It will devolve into forms of government and systems that freedom-loving people do not accept.
Right, right. I have a few more questions, but I do plan to leave some time at the end for audience questions. So if you have some, be thinking about those. Turning to Congress, I mean, you mentioned the miscellaneous tariff bill, which I believe has been expired for a number of years.
3 years, I think.
So what is, I mean, you talked about the partisan bickering and that being the holdup. Well, what do you see as the prospects? I mean, are you optimistic that anything is going to get done in this election year, or is it another year going to come and go and hopefully get it done in 2025?
Well, it depends on the day whether I'm optimistic or not, right? Woke up this morning and I got really optimistic when the Senate passed the foreign aid bill.
Right.
When it goes to the House, ask me then how I feel. But look, I think you can get things done in Congress. And the most important thing for manufacturers and for anybody here who's representing a manufacturing company is to tell our story and to explain, okay, why does this really matter? You want to stop the threats to our national security when it comes to the production of semiconductor chips. You want to build more fabs here. Well, you got to have all the input materials to go into that. Some of those things we simply do not make here. Okay, right. The next question is, well, why don't you make it here? And then my response is going to be, are you going to let me permit a mine? Because it takes 15 years. What do you think the world's going to look like in the year 2039 if we don't get this done now? Right. So we need MTB to, not just to meet our economic goals and not just to feed the supply chains of manufacturers, but also to meet our national security objectives. Some that, we came together on a bipartisan basis on chips and science.
Right.
That was frankly that was a high point, I think, for our government when we did that. Now we got to make sure that all those ancillary issues that go into making chips here in the United States get resolved. MTB is one of those. Permitting reform is another. Tax policy, regulatory policy, all of that will be important.
Right.
And then ultimately, hopefully, trade policy.
Right, right.
And you can see the same thing. I'm going on a tangent here.
Yeah.
But you can see the same thing when we talk about climate change and we talk about decarbonization. Mm-hmm. Set aside how anybody feels about those issues, right? But if our goal is less carbon emissions globally, not just here in the United States, why would we restrict LNG exports, especially to Europe, which, oh, by the way, let's throw in our foreign policy objectives because we want Europe to be less reliant on Russian gas, which, is dirtier than U.S. natural gas,
right.
And reliance on coal. Makes no sense. So these are conversations we're having with the administration. Let's be consistent, right? You want to decarbonize, or you want to lower carbon emissions? Well, then let's use what we've got here in this country, what we're manufacturing, what we're producing in terms of LNG, and get it to Europe as quickly as possible.
Right. But speaking of, being optimistic one day, pessimistic the other, I mean, I remember after the Republicans won back control of the House in the prior election, that there was some optimism that trade might actually be on the Republicans' agenda and they might advance, trade legislation. But that doesn't really seem to have happened.
It's got to start at the administration, the White House level, right? I really, truly believe that. I personally would like to see Trade Promotion Authority just be continuous instead of renewed every few years. I just don't understand that, why that happens.
Right.
I know it provides good jobs for a lot of lobbyists, but it makes no sense to me. Put that into effect. Give the president, whoever he or she is, the authority to negotiate free trade agreements, and let's just do more of those, right? I think it's hard, though, for Congress, without the leadership from the White House, to really move anything on the trade front.
Right.
Because there's some radioactive issues in their minds anyway.
Yeah. Do you think what do you think? If Biden is reelected, do you think there's more chance for what we sort of know as traditional free trade agreements in a second Biden term?
Not sure about that.
Yeah.
I haven't gotten any warm fuzzies on that from this administration, but I haven't from the previous administration either. So I think whoever the American people select as their next president, I think we're going to have challenges on this front. And I do think it's our job, again, to explain why trade is good for communities all across this country. We tell a really bad story. We've never perfected how to explain the benefits that small communities, like where I was from, Chillicothe, Ohio, a small community in southern Ohio, it has benefited from being able to export products that are made right there. The jobs that are provided, by the way, the highest paying jobs of any sector of the economy, right there in Chillicothe, Ohio, and up the road in Circleville. If you talk to folks back home, I went to, those of you who are familiar with Ohio know that Circleville is the home of the Circleville Pumpkin Show, the greatest free show on earth. And if you don't know that, I'll be happy to tell you all about it later. I was there last year, and I was just talking to folks in the crowd. It's a huge, huge festival. And talking to folks I went to high school with and others. And we talk about trade, and man, they are just anti-trade. We got to, it's got to be America only. We're kowtowing to the rest of the world. And when I start talking about the Sofitel plant right down the road and all the jobs that it created there when it opened up in 2017, I think, so much of their product is being exported. They can't make that connection. And I think it's because we've allowed the partisans, frankly, to control the narrative. And it's time for the business community to control the narrative.
Right. Well, I mean, kind of tying two things together, miscellaneous tariff bill, that waives tariffs on inputs that manufacturers need to make products in the United States. I mean, President Trump, his campaign is talking about putting a 10% tariff on all products coming into the United States.
60% from China.
And 60% from China. I mean, what would that do to manufacturing in the United States?
Well, it would, I think the first question you have to ask is not what would happen to manufacturing in the United States from that specific action, but what would happen to the liberalized system of trade around the world when retaliatory tariffs are implemented, right? I mean, this is not just a shot you get to take without getting return fire. It's going to happen. I think we know the answer to that if we read the history books and we see what happened before the Great Depression. We keep testing and testing and testing those boundaries. At some point, the system collapses. So I think that's probably what would end up happening, right? I mean, and by the way, it's not just Trump.
Right.
Both parties dally with tariffs. I think they've been, not that I agree with them.
Yeah.
I'm not saying I'm not passing judgment. I'm just saying that there have been a lot of very specific targeted tariffs over the course of the last few years. But if they're broadly applied, I think you're really asking for trouble.
Right. We talked a little bit about free trade agreements, your frustration that the administration is not out there negotiating more. There is, I mean, Congress in 2019, 2020, I remember, did pass the renegotiated NAFTA agreement, the U.S., Canada, Mexico agreement. We're coming up on the 4th anniversary of that. How do you think that's working out?
Well, look, we have a few issues.
Yeah.
Mexico has a few issues. Canada has a few issues. But that's the nature of agreements, and it's also why I'm actually fairly encouraged. We had the Three Amigos Summit in Mexico City last year. The major focus of that was not just about the border and national security, but also about the free trade agreement. The ministers met in Cancun in July, and I had the opportunity. I was pleased to lead the business delegation to that. And I think that I think what I see from all sides is they want this to work. They're going to figure out all of these issues that are out there, whether they're issues with energy supply or agricultural products. These are issues that can be resolved. And I go back to one of my previous statements, or paraphrasing it, this agreement is incredibly important to our national security, and it is important to our place in the world. We need to expand the relationship, whether it's trade or other relationships here in North America, and we need to embrace the relationships and the allied and our allies around the world in Europe and Australia and New Zealand and Japan and other areas, because we are facing a choice. We're facing a choice between free market economies and democracies and command economies and autocracies. And I want to strengthen the former, not allow the latter to start to bloom.
Okay. I'd like to pause and see if there's any questions out in the audience. I see this gentleman way in the back, so why don't we start with him? I think wait for a microphone to come your way. Yeah, the gentleman right there.
Rob Tobias, and I'm formerly with U.S. Treasury. Now I'm with the National Association of Beverage Importers, as in alcohol. My question builds off of your admiration of Ronald.
By the way, one of my most favorite manufactured products.
In good times or bad times, there will always be a need.
At Tuesday,
I will always be employable.
Couldn't be any better.
And all people do is trade up or trade down, depending on the good time or bad times. But I divert. Building off your admiration of Ronald Reagan, a little background. I was a student at UC Berkeley when it was Governor Reagan, and I was in my third year of Washington with my first job at Treasury when it was President Reagan. Having experienced that, I mean, I won't say would you agree, or what are your thoughts on the proponent that Reaganomics basically has set the economic stage for the last 40 years in this country, and that really forms the roots of the anger against free trade that you saw in Ohio. My minister is from North Carolina. He says that anybody who ever votes in favor of free trade will never get a North Carolinian vote because of the closing of the textile mills. I think, and I believe many of President Trump's supporters are demonstrating that anger. So the question is, do you think the foundation of that anger dates from the long-term impact of Reaganomics, and whether President Biden's executive order on promoting competition can correct that? Thank you.
Well, how long you got? So I suppose there are some roots that go back to the Reagan years. And you mentioned the term Reaganomics, which I think is intriguing because I haven't heard that for a while. I really think that we are, the only way we're going to deal with the frustrations in these communities, and by the way, the congressman I worked for when I first came here in the 1980s, one of them was Alec McMillan, one of them was Jim Martin, and they were all over the textile bill. And I can't even recall what the actual title of it was, but we were scrambling to try to save textile mills all over the South. I think of some of my manufacturers like Milliken in South Carolina who have navigated through all of that, and they're quite successful. And by the way, they're exporters of their product. There are success stories, and then there are stories that are frustrating, that folks grab onto, and they refuse to see the bright silver linings that do occur when you expand opportunities for trade around the world. And I'm going to go right back to what I think is our obligation as business leaders, is to tell that story better. Oftentimes, a lot of my companies, and I don't blame them, right? They're just trying to deal with the day-to-day work and operate their companies effectively and efficiently and profitably. And they don't want to have to tell that story, which is why, frankly, they have organizations like the National Association of Manufacturers to help tell that story. But we have to invest in those stories, and we have to tell the positive stories of what trade liberalization has done. Have there been issues? Sure, there have been issues. I don't think that we would have seen companies leaving, or I should say investing in other parts of the world if we had other policies supporting a liberalized trade agenda. And I'll go back to the very first thing we talked about. We need tax policy that incentivizes investment here. We need regulatory certainty that gives business leaders the ability to plan for the future. We need to invest in workforce incentives. All of those, and infrastructure, which we have done and we continue to do. You can't just open up the trading system and not expect capital to flow outside of our borders if you don't have the right policies internally. That's where we failed. And that's what we developed over the course of the last 30 years was, I think, an understanding that we had to have those policies in place. So I feel much better about where we are in terms of public policy, although we have certainly some challenges, today than we were, say, 10, 20, even 30 years ago.
Thank you. Let's take
Thanks. You touched on an important point where there's a lot of rhetoric in support of American manufacturing, but actually actions that either don't support it or actually undermine the ability to promote manufacturing in the U.S.
Yeah.
And I think about some of those things. When you look at tools that are available, the U.S. Foreign Trade Zone program is one of the oldest trade programs designed to promote the location of manufacturing in the U.S., creating American jobs, promoting global commerce and U.S. exports. And many manufacturers based in the U.S. use the Foreign Trade Zone program, particularly in industries like automotive and pharmaceuticals, which have inverted tariffs, which the program is designed to help them address in global competition. And you mentioned South Carolina. The BMW, which is located in upstate South Carolina, is the largest exporter of U.S. manufactured automobiles, and they operate in a foreign trade zone, as do their suppliers located there, and Michelin being extraordinarily successful, and it has really turned South Carolina into a manufacturing and exporting powerhouse. But when you look, a lot of policymakers really don't know much about the Foreign Trade Zone program, and to the extent that they do, it's got a bad rap. And there's a great deal of reluctance to do anything to support or enhance that program in ways that will promote its goals. So I was wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Couldn't tell you. And I'd just bluntly, Ken Monahan, who runs our international trade division, is much better at helping answer that. So I can't really get into it, but I will say that I do know that BMW does take advantage of that program, and I know that when she was governor, Nikki Haley spoke to our board and used that as one of the incentives, if you will, or one of the reasons to invest in South Carolina, as she very deftly twisted the arms of a lot of my members to try to come to her state. So from what I understand about it, which is very little, it's been successful in those types of investments, but I'm going to let Ken be the guy that answers that afterwards.
Hi, Marilee, International Trade Today. I'm going to build on Doug's question and also a theme that you keep repeating about the story of manufacturing.
I can't see you. Where are you?
She's right there.
Oh, there you go.
She's in the
Sorry.
purple.
Also Mardi Gras.
So anyway, Catherine Tai spoke earlier this week, and one of the questions she received was, why have you kept all the Section 301 tariffs? And the questioner cited a report from an economist who said they didn't add jobs in the heartland, they didn't add manufacturing jobs, but they did help Trump and the Republican Party. And her answer, I'm going to quote it to you, was, "You're right that we have kept a lot of the tariffs because we see strategic values in those tariffs in this exercise of building up the middle class and reinvigorating American manufacturing." So if this administration believes that tariffs are helping manufacturing, and the next administration believes that even more tariffs will help manufacturing, what do you think could change this narrative? Is it that you need to convince the unions to change their tune? Is it if the 10% tariffs were to come into force and they hit also Canada and Mexico, do you need to convince Congress to change the law and overrule it? Like, what will change this trend? Or do you think we're just going to see more and more tariffs over the next 6 years, or no reduction in tariffs because there is this belief it's saving manufacturing?
Well, I can tell you that the workers at Stanley Black & Decker would tell you very quickly that the 301s are not working because they've lost some of their colleagues to layoffs because the 301s created a system where a drill coming in from China that was fully assembled is less expensive than a drill that's assembled here because of the component parts that are being tariffed coming in to Stanley Black & Decker, and the fully finished drill that's coming in from China was not being tariffed. So it's a system that's been set up in a way that is not equitable for many American manufacturers. I think too that because of issues like that, USTR needs to get their review process completed in terms of the exclusions, because we are harming manufacturers in America who are unable to produce some of the parts that are involved in the supply chain for a finished good. And I'm not sure why anybody would think it's good to increase the cost of a product and make a manufacturer in America less competitive. But that's what's happened with many of those 301s, especially when the exclusion process, I think, is arbitrary in many cases, very opaque. Some have gotten their exclusion, some have not. Folks don't really understand how this is working. So I think first and foremost, before we start talking about how good, before any elected official or appointed official starts talking about how good tariffs are, they need to look at the results of how these tariffs have been applied to some manufacturers here in America, and how that's actually cost jobs for American manufacturing workers.
I think we're getting near the end of our time. But on the 301 tariffs, it sounds like you're only talking about exclusions. You're not expecting them to do away with the 301 tariffs.
Well, it doesn't look like it at this point, but I would certainly advocate that that's probably not the best solution for trying to deal with trade imbalances. Look, this is what we said to the last administration.
Right.
We said, don't impose the tariffs.
Right.
Instead, negotiate a rules-based, enforceable free trade agreement.
Right. Okay.
And there was an attempt to do that. It didn't seem to be. I mean, I actually attended the signing ceremony.
Right.
As our friends came over from China with masks, and we're all sitting there.
Right.
Without them a week before the world shut down. And unfortunately, we haven't really seen any progress from that. So we really need, I mean, this is another example of where we need to have some leadership on the world stage to negotiate free trade agreements. And China is clearly one of those. And by the way, if we're adding other countries, let's talk about the UK, let's talk about Kenya, let's talk about Japan, let's talk about Ukraine, for crying out loud.
Oh, wow. Interesting idea.
Let's get these done, and let's marry them with our foreign policy, and let's support free market economies and democracies. That's the way we do that. And then we negotiate with command economies like China so that we can hold their feet to the fire when it comes to trade practices that, quite frankly, just simply aren't fair.
Great. Thank you for those concluding thoughts. Let me give it to Ken.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you, Doug. Really appreciate this thoughtful and insightful conversation about trade and America's place in the world. And really grateful to you for all your great work on behalf of so many leading American companies. Thank you for being here with us today. Yep. Everybody who's here, thank you, Jay. We are taking a short break while we get the stage reset for our ambassadors panel. So don't go anywhere, but we will be back just in a few minutes. Thank you very much.